Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. We are continuing our quest building series, and today we are going to be talking about social quests. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everyone. Yes, today we are going to be talking about social quests. If you've been watching this series, you know that John and I are both describing a quest as something that the DM provides to their players, an objective, if you will, to complete. And we are going to be now diving into the three different types of quests that you can create. Now, JC and I have been essentially modeling this after the three pillars where you have social, encounter, and combat quests. And like I said, today we're going to be talking about the social ones.
Right, and I do want to point out before we get too far into this that even though we're going to be focusing on social questing, most of the time with a social quest or any of these types of quests we're going to cover in the next few videos, the quest itself does not mean that you cannot have other types of encounters. There are social encounters, which are just small blips in the process of going through a quest, and then there's an actual quest. And the same thing is true of combat quests and combat encounters and exploration quests and exploration encounters. So a well-constructed quest, no matter how the main objective is being defined, is usually going to involve at least two pillars of play. And oftentimes it can be three, depending on how the party chooses to handle specific encounters. And I know, for example, Joshua, you were talking to me a little bit about one of the quests you had set up for your party that was designed to have a social outcome and ended up being combat, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, when I come to create quests, I think about it in that conceptualization as myself as a DM. What am I trying to accomplish or get across for my party? What do I want the main focus to be for this? And in this particular example, I was setting up a quest that I had all intensive purposes as being social. It was actually kind of a fetch and delivery quest. The party was meant to go and pick up a caravan from a local establishment within the city they were in and then bring it back to a specific location. And along the line, they had different encounters that were primarily exploration and social encounters that were placed within there in order to engage the party. But they chose to turn one of those encounters into a combat encounter. They didn't play well with others and started a fight, and it made it more combat oriented that has now had lasting effects in the campaign.
Right, and I also want to point out, because this is a good example of a quest that you are defining as a social quest, right? Go and do this, because the main objective of that quest was in order to build social ties in the community with certain powerful people. For myself, the way that I would have classified it, I would have probably classified it as an exploration. Go find this caravan and go bring it back. You talked about there being exploration quests involved, or exploration encounters involved, finding certain things that weren't on the caravan that were supposed to be there, that type of thing. For myself, I would have classified it as an exploration quest. When we're talking about these, we're not trying to set specific rules for the way that you have to, or the way you have to approach, the way you have to look at these. It's just being conscious of the way that you incorporate different types of play and different styles of play into the quests that you create in order to bring in more members of the party so that they can be involved in what's going on. Even in that same quest that I personally would define as an exploration quest, there still would be social encounters. There would still be the opportunity for combat encounters depending on how things played out. The quest itself doesn't change. It would have looked the same. It's just how I would have approached it from a perspective thing more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with the objective you have in mind as a DM, too. Because for me, my objective was building ties with potential allies or creating some distance between them and other NPCs that would maybe classify them as enemies. And because it's such a heavily social campaign, that was my primary focus. But if you were to build this in terms of, I need this party to become more familiar with the city and the establishment and the locale, that's very much exploration, which it did serve that purpose and could have easily been classified that way as well.
Yeah, I really like that point. It's the objective. Because, and this, we talked about side quests in our last video, where we were talking about doing specific quests in order to familiarize your party with the world, whether that's the lore, whether that's the geography, whatever. These types of quests, when you're trying to define quests, that's where social quests specifically shine, because you start to see more of what's going on in the social landscape of the world. Exploration, which we'll get into later, is similar for the geographical aspects of the world. But let's stay focused on social, because I feel like we've already gotten a little... I've gotten a little targeted on exploration. But social...
I think it's good to... I think it's good to distinguish between the two of them. And maybe we should really designate what makes a social quest a social quest.
Sure.
Because I know that lots of lists run on the internet for dungeon masters on what type of quest to create, and they like fall into between like 9 and 13 different options that you can have, and you and I are really like narrowing it down to 3, but we're also grouping some of those other ones.
Right.
So for me, the social quest kind of does fit around that objective. I'm creating relationships and connections with other entities, NPCs, what have you, policy holders, whatever it is within the world, and that's my primary focus. I primarily do this through things that are typically classified as fetch quests, delivery quests, or negotiation quests. Those are what I primarily utilize in order to have a social objective attached to them.
Yeah, and this is something that I talked about in the side quest video as well, is the objective of something like a side quest where you go and do something for someone, a fetch quest, a delivery quest. You start to create allies, and allies are a very social aspect of the game, especially as you're starting to try and discover information for the larger quest arcs and that type of thing, which I can definitely see coming across in the Hawkhurst, where eventually things are going to start coming to a head, and the players are going to need to call on their allies. Those allies will have been formed by performing quests such as the ones you're talking about. What have you done for us? Well, we've done all of these things. We went and got this caravan for you. We went and found all this missing materials that were supposed to be a part of the caravan. We've returned that to you. It was a social quest with the goal of creating an ally or creating an acquaintance of some kind that's going to be beneficial to the party at some point in the future.
Now, I know that you've structured negotiation types of quests before in your own campaigns. I'm thinking of Beckme specifically, that you've done that type of thing. Is there a way that you construct that in order to bring the party into that place? And how do you, and I'm bringing this back a little bit to your point earlier, how do you make sure that you're engaging all the party members in that specific type of quest so that you just don't have your bard stepping forward and talking for the entire group and making one roll and ignoring everybody else?
So there's a lot to unpack in that.
There is.
There are a couple of questions in there. So the first thing is that when I structure my social encounters, and we'll talk about a social encounter versus maybe a social quest, because the quest itself is going to have multiple facets, and there's probably going to be a little bit more involved in that. So specifically, you guys had the goal of obtaining allies, and there was a process of gathering information in order to determine who potential allies could be, and then approaching them and talking with them in order to try and ingratiate yourselves into their willingness to help you with some specific things you had in mind, which was you were trying to overthrow a barony in order to supplant the current baron with one of yourselves. So you guys, in that specific quest, you guys had eventually come to the conclusion you were going to go engage with an elderly noblewoman who was not pleased with the current rulership in the region, and she was more than happy to grant you an audience. So when I structured this, the main thing is that I had to understand the NPC you were interacting with. I had to understand her motivations. I had to understand her temperament. I had to understand what she saw in the world around her, what she wanted the world to look like, and what the type of people were that she was willing to work with, and how desperate she was in order to try and fulfill some of those roles. Now, for her, there was a high degree of desperation. She was the last person in her line. She was seeing the world kind of fall apart around her, and she was very willing to engage with you guys. That being said, when you approached, she is from a human culture and a human dominion, and the group that you brought forward included an orc and an elf, and you also had somebody who was not native to the region who also came along with you. So when we got to the actual quest, the way that I brought people in, and I did not allow the bard to basically take center stage the entire time, was by making sure that she was just as concerned with everybody else in the group as she was with the main person who was being brought forward. She had to understand your motivations, and so it ended up being an encounter which involved multiple party members being required to bring forward their best foot to impress her enough that she was going to be willing to provide support to you. So there was no hiding in the background and hiding in the shadows and just not interacting with her if you could help it, because she was very interested in what each one of you were doing there and what role you were going to play in the events that were going to be coming forward.
And I think that this aspect that you're talking about is so important for a DM to really embody. And in that they understand their NPC, they understand their NPC motivations, and they're bringing that NPC to life in the moment. Because this can really be a challenge sometimes as a DM, as you confront the party with a situation or a scenario, and the party quickly whispers to one another, "Hurry, quick, who has the highest charisma? Send them forward to go talk to the guy," and they set them forward and have them talk to that individual, where everyone else just kind of fades in the shadows. And I've seen this so many times, I think, in the last 20-some years of gaming, that parties do this time and time again, where suddenly 4 or 5 people disappear and one person talks and kind of just brushes them past that engagement. Almost like the rogue who's finding traps in the dungeon and the rest of the party just kind of trailing behind, stumbling over their own feet, and we never talk about how loud the rest of the party is being because the rogue's up front just clearing the way.
Yeah, with their 25 stealth check or whatever. Or in the case of 3.5, we're getting in the 30s and 40s. But yeah, no, it very much is important to bring in the entire party. And the bigger your party is, the more important it is to make sure that people are being allowed to share that focus and that light, so that they don't get forgotten and they don't get lost in the narrative that's going on in any quest or any encounter.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of other examples of where we've utilized this, but I think we've hit a lot of the high points we really wanted to cover with social quests and how we do them. I know for myself, just reiterating what you said earlier, I do think about social quests in terms of making them complex with multiple types of encounters that are in them to make them engaging, because there's nothing worse than telling your party, go pick this up, go drop this off, go talk to this guy and get this done, and then having that be just kind of an in and out situation without any really colorful pieces that progress not only the story but also the character development.
And I guess the only other thing for me is don't rely too heavily on the roles, but don't ignore the roles. So on one hand, if you are basically just allowing your party to come forward and say, well, I just want to persuade her to help us, and then let them roll a d20 and it's a success and that's it, that's not an exciting encounter. It's not engaging. There's nothing that really happened there. You didn't get to know the players didn't get to, or the characters that are being run by the players. You don't get to know the NPC. Everything kind of falls flat. And if you want to develop relationships between characters and NPCs, you've got to have some actual socialization and not just a die roll. That being said, be aware of the fact that the people at your table are not necessarily social geniuses. They may not have super high charismas. Allow them to lean on the notion that their character does have a very high charisma and they are persuasive. And even though they are not able to necessarily convey that in their own personal speech, that doesn't mean that the PC itself wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you pointed that out. I mean, we think about the typical D&D player, and we're typically not the highest on the ranking in social pieces. But for that same reason, I'm really glad that we've covered these types of quests first, because I do think that social quests are the most difficult for DMs to construct. When it comes to combat and exploration that we'll be getting into in future videos, those usually kind of come pretty easily for us in developing them and creating them, because when we think of D&D, we usually lean on those two tiers a little bit heavier than we do on the social aspect. But for myself, who loves the social piece of D&D, this part is super important to me to become invested within a game.
Yep, I agree completely. That sounds like a great place to stop before we get into our combat in the next video.
All right. See y'all then.
Judge and Brew.